Can we go back to last week just for a minute?
Sure.
Okay, so I didn't feel like there was a complete discussion or resolution of some of the ideas, and it's kind of stuck with me. And there's a really nice podcast I listened to called Now and Then. It's by these two historians that take a look back. They look at an issue and they look back to history, American history, to see where similar things were going on and just what lessons might be learned. And it was interesting. The topic that was discussed this week, podcast came out on Tuesday, was infrastructure. And so, believe it or not, it reminded me of last week's Bible study, the topic that we were on, of Joseph enslaving Egypt. And there was a quote that I had heard Lincoln give or ascribe to Lincoln that goes, the legitimate object of man is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but cannot do at all, or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. And there was also another one they gave attributed to Eisenhower that was pretty similar, when he was establishing things like the interstate system. And so, I think there's a good balance that can be made, when we're doing things for people. I think the enslaving part was something that really, I think, captures people's imaginations when they read that, and kind of gets maybe, it could be, I don't know, I'm not going to say anymore. I think that there are lots of ways to look at that story and get engaged, particularly in light of things that are going on today. But all in all, I do think that we are interdependent and we should take care of each other. And if it takes an overarching agreement, like through government, to help us take care of each other, that can be a very good way to do that.
Are you saying that the fire department isn't a half bad idea?
Oh, we came home from Durango one day and there was a fire right across the valley here in Mesa Verde National Park. And, that involves agencies from every level, local, the National Park Service, the Durango Interagency Fire Rescue, and there was a helicopter, ground crews and air crews already on it. We could see the helicopter going back and forth between the local ditch. They put that fire out in a matter of hours, but that's because somebody was on lookout in the national park, and they called the Durango Interagency Fire Rescue, and they were on it. So it saved the park, it saved us. So yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's what came to my mind too. Well, thank you for sharing that. I thought that it would be a good idea to begin today with a word of prayer before we get into the lesson. And then as soon as I'm done, I've already hit record, so I'll share my screen and we'll begin. Would you please bow with me? Almighty God, we thank you for this time together and for this group that has clung together throughout the course of this pandemic and will continue to meet in this way. And thank you for the conversations that we've had and the conversations that we will have. Thank you for your scriptures and the things that they teach us about ourselves and about humanity and about you. I pray that your Holy Spirit will help us as we move forward through today's lesson to enliven us still more. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. This is class 44 of What is the Bible? I've entitled this Reversal of Roles for reasons that will seem obvious as we move in through the story. We'll be covering Genesis chapter 47, verses 27 through 31, and also the entirety of Genesis chapter 48. Genesis chapter 47, verse 27 picks up where we left off as the Israelites are settling into the land of Goshen, and it goes, "Thus Israel settled in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen, and they gained possessions in it and were fruitful and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the days of Jacob, the years of his life, were 147 years. When the time of Israel's death drew near, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "If I have found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal loyally and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I lie down with my ancestors, carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." He answered him, "I will do as you have said." And he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself on the head of his bed. It's just a note as to that last line, something that I did not put in my notes, but something that I'm remembering as I'm reading it, that Israel, when he bowed his head in this sense, is giving something like a ritualistic nod to confirm that this time together is ended. He is not bowing before Joseph as if he were worshiping him. Some commentators make it a point to bring that up because the wording can lead to some confusion. But as to what's happening here, well, obviously Israel/Jacob is approaching death. Sailhammer writes of this: as he approaches death, Jacob's only request is that he not be buried in Egypt. The manner of his request suggests parallels to the sending of Abraham's servant to find a bride for Isaac. So again, we're finding a parallel between Jacob's story and Abraham/Isaac's story. And these parallels run throughout these stories. Even this line, "Put your hand under my thigh and promise," is the exact same line that Abraham spoke to his servant in chapter 24, verse 2. Sailhammer goes on to write, as Abraham approached death, he did not want his son to take a wife from among the people in the land where he was then dwelling, but rather to take a wife from among his own family. In the same way, as Jacob approaches death, he does not want to be buried among the Egyptians, but among his fathers in his own land. A central element of the promise of Abraham was the promise of his own land. The request of the patriarchs to be buried in the land with their fathers brings to the fore their trust in God's faithfulness. Henceforth, an important symbol of one's faith in God's promises is the burial of the faithful offspring in the land of promise. Hybert writes, and this is a quote that we used in a previous Bible lesson, probably half a year ago, when we were talking about Abraham's request in Genesis chapter 24. Well, of this ritual of somebody putting their hand on the thigh, or as it's phrased here, as it's "put your hand under my thigh," Hybert writes, the ritual required of Abraham's servant isn't entirely understood. It may involve touching the male genitals, one meaning of the Hebrew term translated thigh. If so, his hand placement would be a solemn act symbolizing the life or death power of the agreement. And so this is a way of the person making the oath to swear on the progeny or the offspring or the future ancestors to come. It's a very odd ritual by our modern vantage point, but seems to be one well understood in this context. Chapter 48. After this, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," he summoned his strength and sat up in bed. And Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me. And he said to me, "I am going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for a perpetual holding. Therefore, your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt, are now mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are. As for the offspring born to you after them, they shall be yours. They shall be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. For when I came from Paddan, Rachel, alas, died in the land of Canaan on the way, while there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath." Joseph's two sons are mentioned back in Genesis 41, verses 50 through 52. They are born of Joseph's Egyptian wife, Asenath. Remember that will come up later. Handel writes, Jacob adopts Joseph's two sons so that they can be tribes in their own right, yet with close affinity to each other. The reference to Rachel's death, recalled with some emotion, may imply that they are now adopted sons of Jacob and Rachel. That is something Handel is surmising. We cannot know for sure. Either way, these two sons are accepted by Jacob as children of the promise. Sailhammer writes, henceforth, the families of Ephraim and Manasseh are counted among the sons of Jacob and later become two of the most important tribes in Israel. The implication? Ancestors of Egypt are benefactors of the Abrahamic blessing and all that it signifies. Verse 8. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, who are these? Joseph said to his father, they are my sons, whom God has given me here. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, and he could not see well. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I did not expect to see your face, and here God has let me see your children also. Now, you may have seen this disconnect in the text. Verse 8 seems jarring after what came before. Jacob asks, who are these? Immediately after adopting these two sons as his own. So what gives? Well, as we have said throughout the course of these lessons, there are multiple sources from which the redactors, or the ones who compiled the Torah in its current form, were using. And here we have evidence of two source materials. Scholars think that the J, the Yahwist, and the E, the Elohist sources are being woven together. Also note the shift in the name used for Jacob in verse 8, referring to him as Israel, whilst in the verses leading up to this, he is called Jacob. So more evidence of two sources being combined and woven into a common narrative. The description in verse 10a is an echo of Isaac's blindness. In that scene, Jacob tricked his blind father, but now Jacob, the blind father, will trick his son. So the trickster is still up at his usual games, but in this case, he is the patriarch lying blind and old and weak in bed. Much like Isaac was when Jacob approached him to receive his father's blessing that was due Esau. Verse 12. Then Joseph removed them from his father's knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right, and brought them near him. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim, who was the younger, and his left hand on the head of Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, bless the boys, and in them let my name be perpetuated, and the name of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude on the earth. Sailhammer notes, great care is taken to emphasize that in the blessing of the two sons, Ephraim, the younger brother, is given the blessing of the firstborn, Manasseh. As has been the case throughout the patriarchal narratives, the younger son is chosen to carry the line of blessing. Hybert writes, Jacob reverses the status of Manasseh and Ephraim in his blessing by placing his right hand, the symbol of honor, on the head of Ephraim, Joseph's younger son. This event recalls an earlier deathbed blessing in which Jacob received status above his older brother Esau back in Genesis 27, verses 1 through 45, a story that we are well familiar with. This event also explains for the author and his audience the status and the power of the tribe of Ephraim among the northern tribes in their own time. By the period of the divided monarchy, the name Ephraim could be used for the entire northern kingdom of Israel. Here is a reminder that these stories often served as narratives by which the nation could understand their own place in the world. And so this question as to how was it that an Egyptian-born son of Joseph, not Jacob, came to be one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, tribe in Israel. And this story would help them come to terms with that reality. Verse 17. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. As an aside, I would just note that it seems that as if Joseph must think his father is confused, and so he's literally grabbing his father's hands in his old age and trying to reverse them as if it was a mistake. Verse 18. Joseph said to his father, "Not so, my father, since this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." Verse 19. But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his offspring shall become a multitude of nations." So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will invoke blessings, saying, God make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh." So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. That phrase, Joseph is displeased, literally means it was evil in his eyes. Joseph is not at all happy about this. But Israel calms him by prophesying the greatness of both sons, though the younger brother shall be greater, as verse 19 says. The ascent of the younger mirrors Jacob's ascent to his current role as wise patriarch of a great people. Salehammer writes, "We may well ask why there is such concern over whether Ephraim or Manasseh is first, especially in light of the fact that in the next chapter it is Judah and neither Joseph nor his two sons who receives the preeminent position. This issue of preeminence is meant to address the larger question of who stands in a position to receive God's blessing. Throughout these narratives, receiving the blessing God offers does not rest with one's natural status or rights. On the contrary, that blessing is based solely on God's grace. The one to whom the blessing does not belong by natural right becomes heir of the promise." End quote. Still, the question remains, why favor one child over another at all? Here, we must remember the culture into which these stories were first told. They were patriarchal societies that believed that the primacy of the eldest male born of the first wife was a divine right. The point throughout these narratives seems to be to challenge the system of primogeniture, which is just a word that describes this idea that the eldest son is to be preferred. So these narratives is meant to challenge this system so that the people may come to think of God's blessing in a more inclusive way. This may not go as far as modern readers wish that it would, but it certainly would have challenged the assumptions of the day. I found these last two verses especially interesting, as do biblical scholars, because it's difficult to know quite what to make of them or why they even are why they are placed here. Verse 21. Then Israel said to Joseph, "I am about to die, but God will be with you and bring you," plural. It was speaking about you in the singular directed at Joseph. Now it's you in the plural, which would imply that either Joseph is standing alongside perhaps his siblings and his household, or that Israel is addressing Joseph and all of his offspring that are to come, all that is to follow. Either way, Israel says, "God will be with you and bring you," plural, "again to the land of your," plural, "ancestors. I now give to you," again, plural, "one portion more than your brothers, the portion that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow." These last two verses of Genesis 48 are difficult to understand and interpret. Hybert notes, the Hebrew of this verse is difficult. The Hebrew word translated as portion can refer to the city of Shechem, which was on the border between Ephraim and Manasseh. And so maybe this is to explain how it is that these two tribes came into possession or in close proximity to this place of Shechem. Sounds like a similar Hebrew word. But also, Genesis doesn't tell us of Jacob's taking it from the Amorites. There is no story up to this point that describes what it seems Israel is assuming. Also, the word portion used here can also be translated as shoulder, meaning the burden or the portion that the shoulder carries. So there's some ambiguity as to whether this is a blessing or a burden that is to be borne by the ancestors of Joseph. And if so, what does that have to do with the blessing? And these are all questions that these two verses raise that really don't have clear answers. And the biblical scholarship on these two verses is about as clear as what I just read. It's really difficult to discern. Sailhammer writes, these last two verses are difficult to understand, not only in the immediate context, but also within the context of the picture of Jacob that emerges from the narratives of Genesis as a whole. Jacob has been pictured not as a man of sword and bow, but as a quiet man staying among the tents. Elsewhere, Jacob said of the Canaanites, if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed, which seems to push against this idea that Israel has conquered a Canaanite people, the Amorites. Either way, now on his deathbed, Jacob reveals another side of himself as he bequeathed Joseph a portion of the land he took by force, if we were to take the narrative as we receive it. Though he speaks to Joseph, his use of plural pronouns shows that he's addressing a larger audience. That audience appears to be the house of Joseph, which will be represented in the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. And there I included some pictures of some Bronze Age era weaponry. On the left are some bows, and on the right are some swords. These are dated around 1500 to 1300 BCE. So this would be the sort of weapons that they would have used to conquer peoples in those times. Closing thoughts. Ephraim and Manasseh's inclusion into the Abrahamic promise implies that God's promises transcend tribal identifiers and bloodlines. We must never forget that all nations will be blessed by the work and grace of God by way of the promises he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We do well to remember this today as tribal identifiers manifest in racial categories, national identities, and religious dogmas divide the world and give way to violence against one another again and again. We have discussed at length the role birth order played in the organizing of society in biblical times. We have wished that all children were treated as equal heirs throughout these narratives, but we should not discount the significance of the reversal of roles we read about in these stories. The stories about Jacob, Esau, Leah, Rachel, Joseph, Ephraim, and Manasseh would have called into question age-old ways of understanding familial and societal power dynamics. One can imagine how these stories would have been received and understood in light of this. Perhaps an eldest son was challenged not to take for granted what his society claimed was his by right. Perhaps a younger son found their worthiness in these stories and understood himself to be as worthy of blessing as the eldest son. Perhaps a second wife or concubine took heart in the favor shown to Rachel by Jacob and felt less bound by their place in the hierarchy. Lamentably, the voices of many daughters are not heard in these tales, but following the arc of the narrative, one can see where this may lead to a place where distinctions of class, race, gender, and every other cultural marker mean less and less in light of the endless love and boundless blessings God lavishes on us all without discrimination. Next week, we'll be covering Genesis chapter 49, which I am finding in my studies of it very interesting and am looking forward to. I'll bring us back and ask that you unmute yourselves for questions or comments or what leapt out at you.
There is the application today of the country of Israel. And I guess based on these kinds of scriptures that the Jewish people feel that God has given them this land. And then there's all this strife with the Palestinians. Does it go back to this, or is there more modern interpretation?
That is a very complex question to answer.
Yeah.
And the land that was promised the people of Israel was only really theirs as a nation state for a very limited period of time in a few centuries. And they have spent most of their history living in the diaspora, spread out over countries, or existing within Israel as an occupied state. And there have always been Jewish people that have lived there, and a Jewish population in Jerusalem that up until fairly recent history lived, depending on the period of history that you're speaking of, in relative peace with other persons, Christians who have lived there and Muslims who have lived there, and different Christian sects that aren't that don't really fit under the umbrella of what we think of as Orthodox Christianity. When I went to Israel, it was divided into 4 quadrants, and those are historical divisions. Now, what we have mid-20th century is an immense amount of guilt as it relates to the Holocaust, and also a Europe that was still anti-Semitic and did not want Jewish peoples. And so the push to create a nation state out of thin air, as it were, in Israel, Palestine, had its roots in anti-Semitism as a way of getting the Jews out of Europe, and became a physical reality after World War II, as the Jews themselves no longer wanted to live in Europe or in North America. And so what was done was a mass displacement of hundreds of thousands of families who were not Jewish, Palestinians. The son of the general who executed that war has written a book on this and has expressed lament and has decried the human right violations and atrocities that were done. So the question for me becomes, there's 2 things. You have this promise of land and this hope that the Israelite people live in by faith that is never quite achieved, but they're always living on the cusp of hope. Then you have this question of, is the way by which they receive land supposed to be military conquest and the displacement of peoples that had been there for 1,000 years? I would argue that displacing people from their homes, generational homes, is wrong, whoever you are and for whatever motive. Many people by divine sanction have done these things in times past and have found their justification in their holy scriptures. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have all had their periods in history where this has happened. And I think that the effect is what we're dealing with today. When we speak of a hope for peace in the Middle East, how do you find a peace in the Middle East without acknowledging the full humanity of all persons who are in the Middle East, no matter who you are? And so I'm not Jewish, and there are many Jews, by the way, who denounce the state of Israel as a separate entity than their faith, who would agree that if God has promised them that land, then they should rely in faith that they will find a home and a land, and to take it by force in the way that was done is wrong, no matter who you are. And these are I'm sharing my opinions. I think you can share these opinions without being taken as anti-Semitic, to criticize a nation state as a political entity and not criticize a tribe or a people or a religion, which I'm not doing here. I don't know what else to say.
Well, thank you. But I mean, don't some people feel that that land is theirs because God gave it to them?
One of the things that archaeologists did when the state of Israel was established was they sent out people to dig for the title deeds that they believe would be writ on stone tablets, which they have not found.
Interesting.
So why do you think it's so difficult to talk about this? I mean, it becomes so heated.
Because Israel, the nation state of Israel, we have funded upwards of 1/5 of their military, and they operate as our proxy army in that region. And so we have a political incentive that's folded over into a Christian Zionist fervor that sees biblical prophecy written all over the thing. And so the inexcusable is excused time and again. The human rights violations are excused time and again. And when somebody, I mean, the fear of being accused of being anti-Semitic is very real. So people aren't able to distinguish between a critique of a nation state versus a critique of a religion or a people. And I distinguish between the two. I think you can criticize a nation state called Israel without being disparaging to Jewish people. And there are Jewish leagues set up all over the globe who are critical of the state of Israel.
Yeah. There's a group in Washington, D.C., I think it's called J Street, where they're trying to figure out how to change the narrative and promote Israel, but promote Jewish people, and also humanizing Palestinians.
Yeah. It
just seems like it is a rat's nest. I mean, it's just.
Yeah. And it's one that makes me, when I went there, I visited the home of a Palestinian man who lived in Jerusalem, who took us in for tea and fed us. This was right after having been cussed out by an Orthodox priest at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So we kind of were feeling as Christians somewhat confused, and also treated rudely by a vast array of persons. And this Muslim man brought us into his home. It was a shop, and we actually bought a pillowcase from him that we still have. And then he brought us upstairs and treated us to small finger foods and tea. And he showed us what he claimed was the oldest known well in all of Jerusalem, which I don't know how thousands of years old. It was in his house. And he told me his family has lived there for over 1,000 years, passed down generation to generation to generation. And when I watch the news and I hear of persons in the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem having their homes settled whilst they're away for a wedding or out at a funeral, having people come in and throw out their possessions on the curb, I'm wondering if it's not those people. And it makes me feel like it just makes me sad.
The generational cost of trauma is vast, it's huge. And if you find out anything about the settlement of Pale or the things that happened to Jewish people in Europe long before the Holocaust, it was terrible, terrible. You know, how much discrimination and violence there was. And even just, I'm not able to think of the word for it right now, but the drinking of
Blood
Christian
libel.
babies' blood libel. I mean, that was something they were accused of so long ago, and it's resurfacing now, and it's such a lie. But they were put to death and things like that. No.
What Judy's in reference to is what's called the blood libel, which goes back to the Middle Ages, which was a myth, a propaganda myth, which accused Jewish people of baking of cooking the blood of Christian children into their matzah bread as part of their rituals, which was it's complete another fabrication and falsehood. But the irony is that this tragedy is that myth keeps getting repurposed and reframed. And so what you have today are accusations of globalists, which is now the dog whistle for Jewish bankers. They went from Jewish bankers to globalists, but then they'll throw in like the Rothschilds and George Soros, which has happened to be affluent, rich Jewish persons, as stand-ins for this conspiracy theory that posits that there's Jewish wealth behind all of the things that are happening in the world. And amongst those things that is said today is that they drink the adrenochrome, or part of the blood of children, to maintain their power and their youth and vitality, which is just a rehashing of the blood libel, which is an 800-year-old thing. That's
well, anyone that knows the Jewish laws know that the Jews they're not to have blood.
right.
That's right, but people don't know, and so they hear that, and because it's about children, they get really upset. So emotion takes over, and they don't listen to reason. And so you have all the Save the Children campaigns out there that spring out of QAnon, and that's all. They get a lot of mothers involved in this over the course of the past year during the pandemic, because people are communicating through Facebook. And they just were pulled down rabbit holes because they didn't have any other information. They didn't have facts. They didn't have like the real stuff. They just had more and more layers of deeply disturbed crap. So, people who were well-intentioned, didn't get the real information, and they really got propagandized.
Save the Children as an organization, which has been around for some time, that actually rescues children from adverse situations in child trafficking, in the last year and a half have been bombarded with phone calls from people who believe this nonsense, who are sharing bizarre information that they've received online at such a volume that their actual ability to save real children in real situations has been hampered, and it's been a very frustrating thing. They may even have to change their name because the name has been co-opted. All this just,
the point is that when people are injured and it's ongoing for generations, it does something even to the DNA. And I think it creates an environment in which the trauma is then inflicted on other people. And we know this happens. We know it happens in families. And I think it happens between societies. And I'm not saying that is necessarily what's going on in Israel, but, I think the case, if somebody were a real sociologist or historian, they could probably figure that. I'm not trying to promote another propaganda or, some false theory, but I just can't help but believe that the long trauma, that Jewish people have suffered over the many, many hundreds and thousands of years, may have caused them to really want to claim a place where they can be safe. And it's made them blind maybe to other things that, they wanted to be seen as whole human beings, and they haven't. They weren't. They're militarized now to the point where they can't see other things, other people. They can't see things that they've done. Maybe it's just a theory. Don't quote me. Don't post it on Facebook. But,
Well, trauma does leave an imprint that is passed on to your children and your children's children.
mhm.
And descendants of victims of the Holocaust. The research of studying descendants of victims of the Holocaust has actually shown that they have signs of post-traumatic stress without having experienced those things,
Right. Yeah.
which suggests that the trauma itself transmits to our children, that we pass it on through our biology. And I think to me, it seems plausible that and I would say this is across the board, across the globe, that when people are visiting violence on others, there may be centuries of violence behind them that have fueled the fire today.
It just seems to me that throughout history, there's just been people doing evil things to other people, and they retaliate back with the same kind of evil reaction. Just to me, it's just a continuation that's been going on, even back to the birth of the nation of Israel. I mean, people did cruel things. We just continue to not learn to love one another and live in peace as we should.
That's a sermon in 2 sentences, and that was wonderful.
Why is it that they're so concerned about genealogy in the book of Genesis and other parts of the?
Remember that they believed you lived on through your ancestors, and that even in the blessing that was spoken over Ephraim and Manasseh, several houses are named. I Israel bless you, Ephraim. I forget the exact terminology. Let me get my Bible out. But you get the sense that the names themselves of these 2 individuals become the tribes, and people in the, let me read it verbatim. But you, Israel, this is supposed to be Israel saying, but it sounds like he's speaking to a people that will bear his name, and see see their identity rooted in his name and in his story. You, Israel, will invoke blessings, saying, God make you like Ephraim and like Manasseh. And in that blessing, it means like those 2 prominent tribes of Israel that would be the greatest in the northern part of Israel and would outlive the southern part when they fell to foreign occupation for a time. And so the idea is you've traced your lineage back to these great names, and you see yourself as part of their stories. And it was a perspective that focused less on me, Heath. I would focus less on me, Heath Jones. I would rather see myself more as Heath, son of Dennis, son of so-and-so, son of so-and-so, all the way back to the one who was the name from which we all sprang. And that would be my story, my identity. And then I would live on but also Dennis would live on, and everyone else behind me through the names that would join that list. And that's why the closest we touch on this as a culture is our interest in genealogy. But even still, I don't see myself as from the house of Philip Jones, my grandfather. I just don't conceive of it that way. And I don't see, I do see that my grandfather in some ways lives on by the traits and attributes that I choose to take on, that I'm aware of. But we're so bad at transmitting these things that I don't really know much about my grandfather's traits or attributes. It's a vague, hazy memory because we live in a culture for better or for worse, I think there's pros and cons, focuses on the individual as its own, as something that someone who has their own autonomy, irrespective of their tribe or background or class. So I would say, hello, my name is Heath. What is your name? And then I would next ask, what do you do? As opposed to who is your father and who is your father's father. You might learn in those days if you ask, you make introductions with somebody you meet along the roadside. And if they said that they were from the tribe of whatever, some name from the ancient past, you might discern that you had some centuries old beef with that family, and therefore because of your parents' decisions they were your antagonist. I guess like Hatfield McCoys would be a modern sort of way of looking at
exactly what was going through my head. I think that unfortunately what we pass to our children a lot of times, and children's children, is through our rhetoric, what we say, what we talk about. And if all we're talking about is the animosity that we have with another group, it just compounds.
We also need to remember that there are many prophecies about the future, such as Jesus was to come from the lineage of David. So they kept these up so they could track things down. Not that they realized it when Jesus was born, but and also that, what was the other thing? Oh, the priest. The priest had to come from Aaron, from the Levites. And so you had to be in that family to be a priest. And so for the Jewish people back then, it was important as who they were, the job they had, and also looking for the Messiah.
Yeah, it's a different way. We don't look at it quite the same today. We're somewhat unmoored from our ancestral past. And I think, again, there's good and bad things. I do feel like the way we feel cut off from our past as a sort of island floating in the present is not good. At the same time, I do think acknowledging the autonomy of each individual as someone who, irrespective of their family, is worthy and as worthy as you, or that they don't answer to the sins of generations, but are also have their own sense of place without. I'm glad that there is not some equivalent of, not Hatfields and McCoys, Jones and Smith feud, where if I meet a Smith, they're not going to judge me by the things all of the Joneses in their life have done to them,
Yeah, on the reservation, I found out that Navajos always introduced themselves formally by naming their 4 clans. So the mother, father, and one of the grandparent fathers and one of the grandmothers. I can't tell you how they decide which grandmother and which grandfather, but that's how they come to know one another. And so that way they know if they're related to each other. And also, you can't marry someone from your own clan. And it's very important. You never date or marry someone within your own clan. It's taboo. And they also feel very related to each other. So like I would be a grandmother to my great nephews. So they have so many grandmothers and grandfathers and so many aunts and uncles. I mean, there's a whole, everybody is related in that way. So it extends their families vastly in ways that we just don't share. It was very, very interesting that way. That's very tangential. I don't know what brought that up, but so it's less. We're very insular, you know, in terms of like we're individuals, and I don't introduce myself as my fatherly mother's daughter, like you were saying. But in Navajo land, yeah, you do. I mean, everybody knows each other as their family relations. So it's very different.
Yeah.
There's something nice about that.
Yeah, there's something nice about that.
Well, it's also
So-
interesting that even though all of these genealogies, like in the book of Genesis, are all, you know, referenced by the male line.
Oh, yeah.
But you know, today it's mine. I have been told in no uncertain terms that you know, my grandchildren on my son Matt's side, they're Jewish because their mother is Jewish, and because that is carried through the mother.
So are my children. my Kelly's grandmother was Jewish, and her mother, you know, now she even learned when she was in her late teens that she could have claimed a birthright trip. Now she doesn't conceptualize herself as Jewish, but it would have meant something in Germany in the 20s and 30s.
Yeah.
So and my son is, in that sense, I even asked a rabbi 6 or 7 years ago who came in and taught a class in seminary, and I asked her, and she goes, you come to the synagogue and you show proof of your wife's grandmother's Jewish heritage, which we have, then they would be admitted immediately. I was like, wow, like I guess I did not even realize it until that class, and I was like, oh my goodness. The other part, and as they conceptualize it, and then my son is, but unless he marries a Jewish woman, it ends with him there. So, but again, these are not identified. My wife doesn't, she would never claim to be Jewish, actually. I mean, that's not how she sees it. And that's not, her maiden name is McGovern, and she will tell you she's Irish, and that's the way she thinks of it.
Jewish,
No.
Irish.
Yeah. Well, it's 3:00. This has been a good discussion, and about important topics. And it's always interesting. These conversations never go in the directions I think that they might before we start. Thank you for your comments and for your insights and your questions. And I will see you next week. I believe we will have 2 more classes on Genesis. We might have to divide 49 up into 2. Depends on how long that one takes as it's developing. I'm finding the different descriptions of the different sons, that the blessings that Jacob/Israel is proclaiming on his children. I'm finding them fascinating. They're rich with symbolism, and so it'll depend on how long. It'll be a different kind of lesson than what we've been used to. It'll be a very different kind, but I think it will be enjoyable and also a nice breakup in the pacing of these things. So Genesis chapter 49, and I'll see you next week.
Hi, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.